Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be examining a pivotal week during World War II.
October 16th to the 22nd, 1939.
Yeah. So we're only a few weeks into the war at this point,
Yeah.
but things are rapidly escalating and changing.
Absolutely. The globe is still sort of reeling, from the shocking speed of Germany's conquest of Poland.
Yeah.
And it really is a week, I think, where you start to see how the conflict is going to spread, how it draws in more nations, and how the violence is going to escalate in ways that I think were really unimaginable at the start of September.
Right.
It's a week of stark contrasts, where you see diplomatic maneuvering happening alongside the rise of horrifying discriminatory policies. And
Yeah.
I think it's a crucial point to understand if you want to truly grasp the scope and the impact of World War II.
Right. And that's where we're going to deep dive right into it, starting with Monday, October 16th,
October 16th.
1939,
Yeah.
which was a day when the war's reality hit Britain in a very real way.
Yeah. So while the German army, the Wehrmacht, was declaring major combat in Poland to be over, the Polish government in exile, based now in Paris,
Right.
was insisting that their forces were still fighting. This really shows us, I think, on the one hand, the spirit of a resistance. But on the other hand, the world is really struggling to kind of keep up with the sheer speed of events.
Right. And meanwhile, in the city of Gdynia, a major Polish port, all the Polish residents were expelled by the Nazi authorities.
Yeah. So this wasn't just about, taking land. This was about erasing a people from their own city.
Yeah.
And Gdynia was very quickly turned into a German naval base, a very clear symbol, I think, of the Nazis' intentions for conquered territory.
Yeah, and sadly, as we'll see throughout our deep dive this week, this pattern was repeated across occupied Poland.
Absolutely.
Moving to the Western Front, where France and Germany faced off, there was some action in the Saar region. The German army launched an offensive, pushed back French troops.
Yeah. This was a limited action, but it did demonstrate Germany's strength and its willingness to kind of keep the pressure on, even while consolidating its gains in the East.
Right. But the day's most dramatic events really happened at sea and in the air. Because for the first time, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, bombed targets in Britain. They attacked British naval vessels near Rosyth in Scotland.
Yeah, and this attack, though, the British did shoot down 3 German bombers. This really was, I think, a profound shock. It brought the war much closer to home for the British public.
Yeah. And the Battle of the Atlantic, which would be a brutal struggle throughout the war, escalated dramatically this day as well, when Germany announced that its U-boats, its submarines, would attack any British or French ship,
Right.
even those carrying passengers, without warning.
And this was, a direct challenge to the rules of naval warfare.
Yeah.
It was a sign of, I think, how ruthless this conflict was becoming.
Mm.
And this would lead to very heavy losses on both sides and would make the Atlantic, a very, very dangerous place for years to come.
Right. To add even more complexity to the situation, Finland and the Soviet Union's negotiations broke down completely, and Finland began to mobilize its army, knowing that war with its powerful neighbor was very likely.
And I think this is really a sign of how World War II was starting to pull in more countries. What had started as a conflict really in one region was rapidly spreading, and the stakes, I think, are getting higher with every passing day.
Right. Let's move on to Tuesday, October 17th.
Okay.
The air war continued to dominate the headlines as the Luftwaffe again targeted Britain.
Yes. So this time the bombers struck Scapa Flow, which is a major British naval base in the Orkney Islands off of Scotland.
Right.
They also bombed other targets in the Orkneys, and really, these attacks were meant to cripple the British Navy, which is a major threat to Germany.
Right. And at sea, the U-boat attacks were starting to really have a devastating impact.
Yeah.
The passenger ship Yorkshire was sunk with 58 people killed, and this really brought home the human cost of this unrestricted submarine warfare.
And on top of that, the Germans also sank several British cargo ships. And these losses, they disrupted these vital supply lines and forced Britain to start looking for ways to better protect their shipping.
Right. And while all this was going on, the German pocket battleship, Admiral Graf Spee, continued its raiding in the South Atlantic.
Yes.
This powerful warship was preying on British merchant ships, further straining Britain's ability to transport goods and materials.
And so the British really are forced to start organizing these convoys where merchant ships travel together protected by warships, and it's an attempt to make it harder for the U-boats to successfully attack.
Right. On the Western Front, things were quiet, Both sides were building up their forces and preparing for future offensives, sort of an eerie calm before the storm.
And in the diplomatic world,
Yeah.
Turkey decided to end its negotiations with the Soviet Union. And this was because Turkey already had commitments to France and Britain.
Yeah, so Turkey's decision was definitely a blow to the Soviets. They were hoping to secure Turkey's neutrality, if not outright support.
Right. And Switzerland, determined to kind of stay out of the war entirely, reinforced its neutrality by prohibiting immigrants from participating in political activities.
And a lot of these immigrants, of course, were refugees.
Refugees.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Switzerland is really trying to manage, I think, a very delicate situation.
Yeah.
They want to offer sanctuary to those fleeing the conflict,
Mm-hmm.
but they also want to avoid anything that might be seen as taking sides.
Right. And in Finland, Marshal Mannerheim, a very respected military leader, was put in charge of the Finnish army.
Yeah.
And this signaled just how seriously Finland was taking the threat of a Soviet invasion.
They were preparing.
Yeah. As Tuesday came to a close, it was very clear that the war was becoming more complex, more brutal, and more global in its scope. Each day seemingly brought news of further escalation.
Absolutely. And I think Wednesday, October 18th, really reveals much about kind of Hitler's wider ambitions
Right.
and the increasingly dark turn that the war was taking. Right. A secret directive issued by Hitler, codenamed Case Yellow, outlined his plan for the invasion of France and the Low Countries.
Right.
This invasion, as we know, would come in the spring of 1940 and would shock the world with its speed and ferocity.
But, even as he is planning for war in the West, Hitler's already thinking about attacking the Soviet Union.
Wow.
And this really shows just how vast, his goals are,
Right.
how determined he is to really reshape the map of Europe by force.
Right. And October 18th also saw a horrifying new development, the establishment of the first Jewish ghetto in Lublin, Poland.
Right.
This was really a key step in the Nazis' plan to isolate and persecute Jews.
Yeah. And Jews in the city of Wukowek were ordered to start wearing the Star of David. This was a way to mark them out, to separate them from the rest of society,
Right.
to make them easier targets for discrimination and violence.
And it's important to note, I think, that not everyone in Germany supported these actions. General Johannes Blaskowitz, a German army commander, actually complained to Hitler about the brutality of the SS
Right.
in Poland.
But his protest was ignored. And I think this shows, on the one hand, that there was some dissent within the German military, but it also highlights how firmly Hitler was in control and how determined he was to carry out his plans no matter how horrific.
Yeah. Adding to the unease of the day, Germany and the Soviet Union conducted a prisoner exchange, which involved around 30,000 Polish soldiers and refugees being transferred between the two countries.
And this cooperation, coming so soon after their joint invasion of Poland, I think served as a reminder to the world of this strange and cynical alliance between these two ideologically opposed regimes.
Right.
But for the moment, their shared goal of expanding their territory outweighed their differences.
Yeah. The fighting at sea continued with a tragic incident involving the Dutch passenger ship Simon Bolivar. The ship struck a German mine and sank, killing 86 people.
Yeah, and this really highlighted, I think, the dangers faced by neutral countries trying to stay out of the war. The seas were becoming increasingly hazardous, and even innocent passengers were at risk.
Right. The Luftwaffe continued their attacks on British naval bases.
Right.
But this time they were met with stronger defenses at Scapa Flow.
Yeah.
The British were learning and adapting.
They're learning and adapting.
Making it harder for the German bombers to inflict damage. There were also two curious incidents involving German aircraft in Britain. A reconnaissance balloon landed in Scotland, and a bomber crashed off the English coast.
Yeah, so, these events, I think, suggest that Germany was stepping up its intelligence gathering efforts, trying to learn as much as possible about British defenses and capabilities.
Yeah. On the diplomatic front, the leaders of Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark met in Stockholm
Right.
to discuss the growing threat posed by both Germany and the Soviet Union. They were all small countries caught between powerful and aggressive neighbors,
Right.
and they were desperate to stay neutral.
And Germany reaffirmed its neutrality in a potential conflict between Finland and the Soviet Union. And this was likely a tactic to try to keep Sweden from siding with Finland.
Yeah. Meanwhile, British and French military leaders arrived in Ankara, Turkey.
And they were there to secure Turkish cooperation after Turkey had held talks with the Soviets. So, the Allies are working hard to shore up their alliances,
Right.
knowing that they're going to need all the help they can get in the coming struggle.
Back in Germany, Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking SS officer, issued a decree that restricted the movement of Romani people.
Yeah, and this is another sign of the Nazis' racial policies and the expanding scope of their persecution. Like the Jews, Romani people would face increasing hardship and ultimately genocide.
Hitler also established the War Merit Cross, a new medal intended to recognize contributions to the war, even for those who are not fighting on the front lines.
Right.
And in the United States, President Roosevelt took a step towards trying to maintain American neutrality in the face of the escalating conflict. He banned armed submarines from American ports.
Yeah, and this was a difficult balancing act for Roosevelt. He wanted to support the Allies, but he also knew that American public opinion was very strongly against getting directly involved in another European war.
Right. There was also a development in Asia worth noting. British, Japanese, and American troops withdrew from an international zone on Gulangyu Island near Semen, China.
Right. And this was a small step towards easing tensions in a region that was already seeing a lot of conflict, primarily between China and Japan.
Right. So Wednesday, October 18th, was a day of contradictions. Diplomatic efforts and strategic planning alongside escalating violence and discriminatory policies.
Absolutely. Looking back at these events from October 16th to the 22nd, they may seem like this jumble of headlines at first glance, but I think they all point to these larger trends that really define World War II. It's not just about knowing what happened, but understanding why it matters.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. For example, the sinking of those merchant ships or the establishment of the Jewish ghetto in Lublin, those aren't just isolated incidents. They really speak to the way that this war targeted civilians and entire populations, not just armies.
Exactly. And you see the signing of those treaties, the diplomatic back and forth, that really shows how this conflict forced nations to take sides, even if they were reluctant.
So as we reflect on this week in 1939, what are the long-term implications of these events? How should we be thinking about them in terms of the broader historical context?
Well, we're talking about the very early stages of a war that would reshape the entire world. The decisions made, the alliances formed, the atrocities committed during this 1 week cast a long shadow.
So let's break down some of these key themes that emerged this week and maybe how they played out over the course of the war.
Well, the first theme, and perhaps the most disturbing, is the escalating violence and brutality. The German blitzkrieg in Poland was a shock, but this week showed that those tactics weren't limited to just that one campaign.
Right. The air raids on Britain, the unrestricted submarine warfare, the persecution of civilians in occupied territories, all point to this blurring of the lines between combatants and non-combatants. This was total war where everyone was a potential target.
And that targeting of specific groups, particularly Jews, based on racial ideology, was a chilling sign of the horrors to come. The establishment of that Jewish ghetto in Lublin, that wasn't just a matter of relocation. It was the first step in this systematic process of dehumanization and segregation that would culminate in the Holocaust.
It's a really stark reminder of what can happen when hatred and intolerance are allowed to take root.
Absolutely. The second theme I think we see emerging is this intense diplomatic activity, this maneuvering of various nations as they're trying to navigate this increasingly complex conflict.
The signing of the Anglo-French-Turkish Treaty of Mutual Assistance was a major development. It showed that the Allies were really actively working to contain the Axis powers to try and build this coalition against aggression.
But it is important to remember that treaty specifically excluded conflict with the Soviet Union.
Right.
And that highlights the really complicated nature of these alliances at the time. The Soviets were allied with Germany, at least on paper, but they were also viewed with deep suspicion by the West.
And their actions in Eastern Europe, like annexing those territories in Poland under the guise of these staged elections, really demonstrated their own expansionist agenda. They were playing their own game, taking advantage of the chaos to try and increase their own power and influence.
Absolutely. And I think the events of this week really show just how fluid these alliances were, how quickly the situation could change. No one could really be sure who their friends or enemies might be in the long run.
It's a reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy. It's full of these unexpected turns and betrayals.
Absolutely. The third theme that we see emerging this week is this ideological battle that was at the heart of World War II. This wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a clash of ideas, a struggle between democracy and totalitarianism.
Right. So on one side, you had the Nazi regime with its propaganda, its cult of personality, its brutal suppression of dissent, and this horrific racist ideology. And on the other side, you had the Allied powers, who, despite their own flaws and internal divisions, were fighting to defend these principles of freedom, self-determination, and human rights.
And I think Pope Pius XII's condemnation of racism, cultural superiority, and totalitarianism was a powerful statement. It placed the moral authority of the Catholic Church firmly on the side of the Allies.
And you see the British War Office recommending that soldiers read both Mein Kampf and the Communist Manifesto. It shows that they understood the importance of understanding these ideologies that were driving the conflict.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that ideas have consequences. And the ideologies that led to World War II had a devastating impact on millions of lives. And it's so essential to be aware of the dangers of extremist ideologies and to actively combat them.
Finally, I think amidst all of the grand strategy and political maneuvering, we must never lose sight of the human impact of the war. These individual stories, the acts of courage, the suffering endured, these are what give the historical events their true weight and meaning.
Commander R.F. Jolly, who continued to command his ship even after being mortally wounded during the Luftwaffe attack on Rosyth, exemplifies the bravery and selflessness displayed by countless individuals during the war.
And the plight of those Polish civilians facing these mass executions and deportations. That growing fear and uncertainty felt by people around the world, these are the human costs of conflict. Costs that I think are often overlooked in the grand narratives of history.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the dates and the battles and these political machinations, but we have to remember that behind all of that are real people, real lives that were shattered by this war.
Now, to better understand the significance of some of these themes, let's examine a few specific events in greater detail.
Okay, a good place to start, I think, is with those first Luftwaffe bombing raids on British soil on October 16th. So this attack on Rosyth, while it didn't cause massive damage, it had a profound psychological impact on the British people. It really shattered any illusions they might have had about the war being fought far away.
It also signaled this shift in German strategy. Up until this point, the Luftwaffe had primarily focused on supporting the ground forces in Poland. Now they were targeting Britain directly. They were aiming to cripple their navy and weaken their resolve.
Absolutely. And the attack on Rosyth also highlights the growing importance of air power in modern warfare. Control of the skies was becoming increasingly vital, and both sides would pour enormous resources into building up their air forces.
On October 17th, we saw another major turning point, this order from Admiral Dönitz authorizing unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied shipping. This decision, while strategically advantageous for Germany in the short term, was a clear violation of international law and would have far-reaching consequences.
And the sinking of that passenger ship, the Yorkshire, with the loss of 58 lives, demonstrates the brutality of this new approach. It also outraged public opinion in Britain and the United States, further turning sentiment against Germany.
And as we know, the U-boat campaign would prove to be a major challenge for the Allies throughout the war. They'd be forced to develop new technologies and tactics like convoy systems and sonar to counter that threat.
And I think the U-boat campaign also brought into sharp focus the ethical dilemmas of war. The targeting of civilian ships raised these difficult questions about the acceptable limits of warfare.
On October 18th, the establishment of the first Jewish ghetto in Lublin marked this chilling milestone in the Nazi persecution of Jews. And as we know, this act of segregation and confinement was just the beginning of a process that would lead to the systematic extermination of millions.
Yeah, and the ghettoization of Jewish communities was really a key part of the Nazi plan to isolate, dehumanize, and ultimately eliminate Jews from Europe. It allowed the Nazis to control and exploit Jewish labor, to confiscate their property, and to prepare for their eventual deportation to concentration camps.
It's a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice and discrimination and the erosion of human rights.
Absolutely. On October 19th, the signing of the Anglo-French-Turkish Treaty of Mutual Assistance really represented a significant diplomatic victory for the Allies.
Securing Turkey's neutrality and potential support was a major strategic goal for the Allies. It gave them control of the strategically vital Turkish Straits, which connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean.
Right. But the treaty's specific exclusion of conflict with the Soviet Union really underscores this complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the early stages of World War II.
Yeah. The Soviet Union was still technically allied with Germany, but their relationship was definitely marked by suspicion and distrust. Both sides were looking for opportunities to expand their influence, and they were willing to use each other to try and achieve those goals.
Absolutely. And on October 20th, The German Navy's decision to abandon all pretense of warning merchant ships and convoys before attacking was a further escalation of that unrestricted submarine warfare. And this was a gamble on the part of the Germans as it risked further alienating neutral countries, particularly the United States.
Right. It showed just how desperate the Germans were to try and cut off Britain's supply lines. They knew that Britain was an island nation, heavily dependent on imports, and they believed that if they could strangle their economy, they could force them to sue for peace.
Absolutely. And the intensification of the U-boat campaign would have a profound impact on the Battle of the Atlantic. It would also lead to a series of diplomatic crises as neutral ships, including those from the United States, were attacked and sunk.
On October 21st, the British War Cabinet held its first meeting in their newly constructed underground bunker beneath Westminster. This was a symbolic act. It showed that the British government was really preparing for the long haul. They were digging in, both literally and figuratively, determined to resist Nazi aggression no matter what.
And the construction of the bunker was also a recognition of the growing threat posed by German air power. The Luftwaffe was rapidly expanding, and the British knew that they were vulnerable to attack from the air.
The meeting in that bunker marked a turning point in British attitudes towards the war. It was a sign that they were no longer underestimating the threat posed by Germany.
Absolutely. And on October 22nd, those staged elections in Soviet-occupied Poland provided a convenient cover for the annexation of those territories. This was a blatant act of aggression by the Soviet Union, but it was largely ignored by the Western powers, who were preoccupied with the threat from Germany.
And that Soviet annexation of eastern Poland would have long-lasting consequences. It would lead to the displacement of millions of people, the suppression of Polish culture and identity, and decades of Soviet domination.
And it's also important to remember that the Soviet Union, despite its alliance with Germany, was not a benign actor. They were just as ruthless and expansionist as the Nazis, and they would commit their own share of atrocities during the war.
As we wrap up this second part of our deep dive, it's clear that the events of this week in 1939 were not just a series of isolated incidents.
They were part of a much larger and more complex story, a story of escalating violence, shifting alliances, ideological conflict, and immense human suffering. It's a story that continues to resonate today, reminding us of the fragility of peace and the importance of vigilance in defending our values.
As we sort of delve even deeper, I think, into the events of this week in October 1939, it becomes increasingly clear that the world was standing on a precipice. The decisions made, the actions taken, the ideologies that were at play during this period really set in motion this chain of events that would shape the course of history for decades to come.
You know, it's essential to remember that history is not just this collection of facts and figures, but a narrative of human choices and their consequences. And by studying this week, I think we gain a deeper understanding of how conflicts escalate, how alliances shift, and how ideologies really shape the world around us.
So what are some of the, I guess, most crucial lessons that we can draw from this week? Things that might help us to navigate the complexities of our own time.
Well, I think one of the most significant takeaways is the importance of safeguarding democratic values and institutions. The rise of Nazi Germany, with its totalitarian ideology and systematic oppression, really stands as a stark warning, I think, against complacency and the erosion of democratic norms.
Right. We must be vigilant in protecting freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the rule of law. We must also be aware of the dangers of propaganda and disinformation, which can be used to manipulate public opinion and undermine trust in democratic institutions.
Absolutely. And another crucial lesson is the importance of diplomacy and international cooperation in resolving conflicts. The events of this week, with its intricate web of alliances and rivalries, it shows how quickly situations can escalate when communication breaks down and mistrust takes hold.
Right. We need strong international institutions and a commitment to dialogue and diplomacy, even when dealing with those with whom we disagree. The alternative, as World War II so tragically demonstrated, is far too costly.
Absolutely. It's also important to recognize that history is not just something that we study in textbooks. It's a living force that shapes our present and our future. By understanding the past, by grappling with its complexities and its tragedies, I think we can gain valuable insights into the challenges that we face today.
Yeah, the events of October 1939, though seemingly distant, really hold this mirror up to our own time. We see echoes of those events in the rise of nationalism, the spread of intolerance, the threat of global conflict.
It's a reminder that peace is not a given. It's something that we must actively work towards day by day through our choices, our actions, our commitment to building a more just and equitable world.
As we conclude this deep dive, let's remember the words of philosopher George Santayana, who famously said, Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right. Let's strive to learn from the mistakes of the past. Let's honor the sacrifices of those who came before us. Let's build a future where the horrors of World War II are never repeated.
And that concludes our deep dive into this pivotal week in October 1939. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.